So the first presentation is given by Sandra COMER from New York, from the University of Columbia. She's got a 20-year-long experience on research on opioids, and she's going to tell us about the interest of using gabapentine as a potential treatment for opioid use. So we're going to give her the floor for 20 to 25 minutes for her presentation so that you have some time for Q&A afterwards. She is also a very good swimmer, so I wonder whether she will leave the room as soon as possible to well, just grasp the opportunity that she's in Biarritz. So, well, you have the floor.
So thank you for that nice introduction, and I'd like to thank the meeting organizers for inviting me here to give this presentation. I have no conflicts of interest to declare. Oh, actually, I also wanted to mention that my co-investigators, Drs. Suzette Evans and Richard Fulton, were co-investigators on this study. So we know that alcohol use disorder is very prevalent. These are data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, reporting on past year alcohol use disorder, and you can see that about 15 million people reported having this disorder in the US. About 8 million people reported illicit drug use disorder, and there's about 2.7 million people who have co-occurring opioid or illicit drug and alcohol use disorder. So these are very prevalent disorders. These are data from a single-day assessment of substances that are used by people who are in treatment. So the majority of them are using just a single drug alone. And a very large percentage, over a third of patients, report co-abuse of drugs and alcohol. Opioids specifically are very commonly used in combination with alcohol. Both are central nervous system depressants, and they can be lethal when used together. So that's one of the major problems with people who use the combination. We also know that treatment outcomes are very poor among people who are receiving medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder who also use alcohol. So the relapse rates are higher in this population, and the toxic effects are very well known. So in my laboratory, we use models of where people are living inpatient in the hospital, and we give them the various drugs that we're interested in studying. And we assess the effects of different types of treatment medications that we think might be useful for treating the disorder. So we became interested in gabapentine for various reasons. One is that it has effects in modulating GABA and also perhaps glutamate neurotransmission. So gabapentine has a very good safety and tolerability profile, and it's in widespread clinical use for many indications, both on and off label, including seizures and neuralgias for on-label use, and then also pain, anxiety, and sleep disorders as off-label use of this medication. So Dr. Evans in our group, as well as in collaboration with Dr. Adam Basaga, ran a laboratory study where they examined the effects of acute administration of gabapentine. So they gave a single dose prior to administration of alcohol, and this is a 0.75 grams per kilogram dose of alcohol, which is a pretty hefty dose. And they reported that it did not alter the subjective effects of alcohol. So they went up to 2,000 milligrams of gabapentine And it also did not alter craving for alcohol in heavy drinkers. So that was a little bit discouraging. But other studies around the same time showed that patients who are maintained on gabapentin, so with repeated doses of gabapentin, up to doses of about 1,800 milligrams per day, showed increased rates of complete abstinence from alcohol in patients with alcohol use disorder, and it also improved mood, sleep, and craving. In other studies, gabapentin was shown to reduce alcohol-related withdrawal symptoms. So when given chronically, gabapentin does seem to be effective it seems to be useful for treating alcohol use disorder. So with regard to opioids, there were only rodent models when we first started this study, but they were in the positive direction. So gabapentin prevented the development of morphine-induced conditioned place preference. It's a model of the euphoric effects of morphine, and it also blocked morphine-induced dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens. So we thought that maybe it would be useful as a single medication that could treat both disorders simultaneously. Soon after we started the study, however, reports like this started to come out where they were reporting misuse, abuse, and diversion of gabapentin itself. So that made us pause because we obviously don't want to, increase abuse of a substance. But then we decided to continue with the study because it's actually designed perfectly to try to answer this question of whether or not gabapentin does have abuse liability on its own and in combination with opioids, because that's the drug of abuse that it's often used in combination with. So our studies included, it was an 8-week inpatient study using a within subjects design. So all of the subjects received all of the conditions. These were people who were not interested in seeking treatment for their opioid or their alcohol use disorder. Because we give the opioids and the alcohol in the laboratory, we feel that it's unethical to give somebody who's interested in treatment the drug that they're trying to stop taking. So these participants were paid for their participation in our study. They had opioid use disorder, and they were physically dependent on opioids, so these were primarily heroin users. They also reported, or they met criteria for alcohol use disorder. So even though they met the criteria for the disorder, we did not accept them into the study if we believed that they were physically dependent on alcohol. Alcohol withdrawal can be fatal in people, and so it was too risky for us to enroll those people. So they met the criteria for alcohol use disorder, but they were not physically dependent. They were required to use opioids and alcohol simultaneously, and the reason for this is that we were concerned about the toxic effects of the combination, and if somebody uses them both at the same time, then that would be the most toxic use. Because they were physically dependent on heroin when we brought them into the hospital, we maintained them on morphine, so we gave them 30 milligrams 4 times a day to kind of mimic the pattern of heroin use that they engage in when they're outside. The gabapentin maintenance doses that we used included placebo, so it was 0 milligrams, and 1,800 milligrams a day of gabapentin, and this dose was chosen based on the studies that I described that Barbara Mason reported as being effective for treating alcohol use disorder. We tested 9 separate doses in a randomized double-blind condition, so everybody received solution to drink during the lab session. The gabapentin maintenance doses were also given under double-blind randomized conditions, so half of the subjects received placebo, gabapentine first, half received 1,800 milligrams, and then they switched to the other dose midway through the study. So we gave a placebo test dose, which consisted of no alcohol and no oxycodone, and just whatever solution they preferred. So some people preferred a soda, some people preferred tonic water, and so we blinded the doses by dropping a peppermint oil on top. They also received alcohol by itself at a dose of 0.5 grams per kilogram, and then also in a separate session, a higher dose of 0.75. We tested 2 different doses of oxycodone, so 15 and 30 milligrams. And then we tested the combinations of the alcohol and the oxycodone as well. The primary dependent measure that we used in this study was visual analog scale ratings of drug liking. So this is the endpoint that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, requires the investigators to use if they're interested in approving a medication for substance use disorders. We also measured other visual analog scale ratings, and so the visual analog scale is basically a 100 millimeter line anchored on one side with not at all and the other side with extremely, and the subjects are simply asked to place a mark along that line about how they feel. We also measured physiological responses mostly for safety. And this is what the study design looked like. So as I mentioned, it's an 8-week study. It was done entirely in the hospital. So when they first came into the hospital for the first week, we stabilized them on morphine, and then we stabilized them on the first dose of either gabapentine or placebo. And then the 9 doses were given on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays for 3 consecutive weeks. Then during the 4th week, they transitioned over to the next dose of gabapentine, and we tested the same doses of test drugs again, the same 9 doses. So 13 men completed this study. They were in their mid-40s. They were from a wide variety of ethnic backgrounds. The study was done in New York City, so it's ethnically diverse. The majority of them were intranasal heroin users. Some of them used both intranasal and intravenous heroin. They were basically daily users of heroin. Some people, didn't have enough money at the time that they came into the study, so they were only using 4 days a week. But these are basically heavy heroin users. They reported using on average about 8 bags a day of heroin, and they also drank alcohol about 6 days a week, and they would drink about 5 drinks per occasion. So these were binge alcohol drinkers. 4 additional subjects discontinued the study early. 2 dropped for personal reasons, and two were discontinued for elevated blood pressure. So even though we evaluated them very carefully before they were admitted into the study, sometimes they don't always tell the truth, and so we suspected that they might be physically dependent on alcohol, and so we stabilized them and then discharged them. So the first question that we had in this study was whether or not gabapentine alters the abuse liability of oxycodone and alcohol alone, and when they were given in combination. So I just want to orient you a little bit to this slide because the next several slides will be in the same format. So on the x-axis is alcohol dose. Each of the panels represents alcohol given in combination with oxycodone, either the 0 milligram dose. The middle panel is oxycodone at 15 milligrams, and then the right panel is oxycodone at the highest dose of 30 milligrams. So what you can see from this figure is that alcohol significantly increased liking. There you can see that there's a nice dose-related increase in liking across all of the oxycodone conditions. Oxycodone, however, did not affect liking. And if you look at the data points here, what I'm showing you is On the very left panel is just placebo, so that was nothing. The middle panel shows 15 milligrams of oxycodone, and the right panel shows 30 milligrams of oxycodone. So when we first started this study, in the first subject, we gave the doses in ascending order because we weren't really sure how safe the dose combinations would be. And so we originally started with higher doses, so we tested 40 and 80 milligrams of oxycodone, which is, those are pretty hefty doses, but again, these are heavy heroin users, so we thought maybe it would be safe. The first subject that we tested with those doses, it was fine when we gave the oxycodone by itself, but when we started adding the alcohol on top of the oxycodone, he became very, very sedated. And this was under placebo maintenance conditions, and we were worried that once we introduced gabapentin, that it would just be too much. So we made a phone call and had a conversation with our project officer from NIDA, which is the organization that...
Un responsable du NIDA, qui est l'une des organisations qui a parrainé notre étude, et on a décidé par sécurité qu'on allait baisser la dose d'oxycodone. Et je sais que cette dose d'oxycodone ne serait pas trop appréciée parmi cette population. Et voilà, encore une fois, je vous dis, c'est des usagers d'héroïne intraveineuse ou intranasale. Et voilà, ils n'aiment pas trop. On ne croit pas qu'ils aimeraient trop les effets de l'oxycodone oral, mais c'est le mieux que l'on a pu trouver pour eux. Aussi, quand on a ajouté la gabapentine et quand on a établi les dosages que l'on testait, eh bien, la gabapentine a été administrée de façon randomisée parmi tous les sujets. Et ce que l'on a trouvé, c'est que la gabapentine toute seule n'augmentait pas la propension ou l'inclinaison
analyze the data.
les drogues, ce qui est bien.
But when we gave it in combination with oxycodone, liking increased. So these are even doses of oxycodone that they don't really report feeling much effect from by themselves, but when given in combination with gabapentin, the liking increased. And overall, you can see from the black circles compared to the white ones, gabapentin significantly increased liking across all of the conditions that we tested. So when we asked people to answer the question of how high they feel, is that these ratings that I'm showing you are, again, on a 100 millimeter scale, but I took the average across the session. So we asked them repeatedly how they're feeling throughout the session, and so these are the averages. And again, gabapentin alone did not increase ratings of I feel high, but when given in combination with these doses of oxycodone, ratings of high increased. And the overall effect of gabapentin was significant in terms of increasing ratings of I feel high. With regard to feeling sedated, 1,800 milligrams of gabapentin is a pretty big dose, and reports of sedation are fairly common. But under these conditions in this population, ratings of feeling sedated did not increase when gabapentin was given by itself. Again, similar to ratings of drug liking and feeling high, the gabapentin appeared to increase the oxycodone-induced ratings of sedated. And overall, gabapentin significantly increased ratings of sedated. So you might wonder why the doses above the 0.75 grams per kilogram of alcohol with the highest dose of oxycodone might have gone down. The reason for that is that they were extremely sedated, and we're having a hard time answering the questions, actually. So these are ratings of how much they would be willing to pay for the doses that they received. So gabapentin alone did not affect the amount that subjects would pay for the drugs. And, but unlike the other effects, the amount that they would be willing to pay for oxycodone by itself when given in combination with gabapentin did not change. But overall, the gabapentin increased the amount subjects would pay for drugs, so the same general pattern is found here for this effect. It was not statistically significant, so the p-value was 0.06, but the trend is in the same direction as the other effects. Similar findings were observed for ratings of potency, so, you know, gabapentin by itself did not increase ratings of potency, but overall it's producing effects kind of in the same general direction as how much they'd be willing to pay. Same with ratings of high quality. So across a number of different subjective effects that have been shown to be predictive of the abuse liability of a drug or a medication, we're seeing increases in abuse liability. So reports were also coming out that people who use gabapentin might also be more likely to overdose. So we were, you know, carefully evaluating the potential toxic effects of the combination. So what I'm showing you here is trough oxygen saturation across the 9 dose conditions under placebo maintenance. And oxycodone decreased oxygen saturation, and this effect was significant. It's statistically significant, I just want to emphasize, but it's not clinically significant. So, you know, you or I, if we measured our oxygen saturation, it'll be around 98, 99. So a 1% decrease in oxygen saturation is not at all clinically significant, but it's an opioid that we're giving, so we can expect that it would produce small reductions in oxygen saturation. Alcohol, interestingly, also decreased oxygen saturation. You can see here that under placebo conditions, the oxygen saturation due to alcohol decreased. But when gabapentin was given in combination with the dose combinations, it was not statistically significant. We might see a little bit of a hint of a decrease under placebo oxycodone conditions, but again, these are not clinically significant decreases. This is another measure of respiration. This is trough respiratory rate. So obviously, you know, opioids decrease respiratory rate. And there was gabapentin did not significantly alter respiratory rate. We also looked at peak end-tidal CO2, so the amount of carbon dioxide that they emit usually goes up. And gabapentin did not significantly alter end-tidal CO2. So what we're concluding from this study is that gabapentin increases the abuse liability of alcohol and the combination of alcohol and oxycodone. It's a little bit more difficult to make definitive statements about how it affects the abuse liability of oxycodone by itself because these doses were pretty low. But under these experimental conditions in this population at these doses, there was little evidence that oxycodone increases respiratory depression. So the question is, what are the implications for treatment, right? You know, you can evaluate the data in a number of different ways. And this is a recent publication discussing this issue because gabapentin, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, is very widely used for lots of different kinds of indications, including the treatment of substance use disorders. So on the one hand, you can argue that if a medication increases drug liking, increases, you know, gives patients a little bit of a buzz, then medication compliance would be improved. You know, if you're very conservative, you would say, no, you know, it's increasing the abuse liability, that's not a good idea. Gabapentin has been shown to reduce anxiety in people who have substance use disorders. It improves sleep. So, you know, I'd be curious to see what your opinion is on this question. So I would like to thank NIDA for funding this study. And I would also like to thank the people in my lab who helped collect all of this data, especially Dr. Jeannie Manube. She's the medical director of my lab, and I always make her nervous with the doses that I want to test. I'd also like to thank all of my colleagues at Columbia. We've been working together for a very long time. And in particular, I would like to acknowledge my mentor and colleague, Dr. Herb Kleber. He's sitting on the very left chair. He passed away just earlier this year. But I also wanted to show you this because it showed up in Google Doodle yesterday, and we were all very excited. So it was a tribute to Herb and the amazing influence that he had on the field. So I dedicate this talk to him. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation.
Thank you very much for the presentation, because it really gives us food for thought when it comes to, well, wondering whether gabapentine would be a possibility or not. So do you have any questions about the results, about the perspectives, about, well, the indications of gabapentine? You can break the ice.
A lot. You may know that my Canadian colleague, Dr. Gomez, and I wrote papers on the risk of opiate overdose deaths, and it was increased in people who had a combination of heroin use and gabapentin and other pentanoids. Mm-hmm. So what do you think? Did we see something that wasn't there? Or you think it might be still a risk in the combination of having opiates and gabapentin for overdose, although I didn't see a lot of effects on the respiratory system.
Yeah, I mean, I would never want to, you know, encourage the use of a medication that would increase the toxicity of any drugs that our, you know, population uses. So, I mean, I kind of feel like with just about any medication that we use, methadone, buprénorphine, I guess not so much naltrexone, but there are risks associated with their use. Methadone, for example, you know, in the hands of a clinician who is not familiar with how to initiate it, can cause, you know, a patient to die. I think that, you know, gabapentin probably does have a place in treatment. You know, a lot of patients feel like they do benefit from it. I think that it has to be used cautiously. So, you know, as with any medication, we have to weigh the risks and the benefits. From our study here, it doesn't seem like gabapentin by itself has much in the way of abuse liability. I'm a little bit nervous because, you know, these doses that we're testing were low because I can't push the dose for safety reasons. So all I know is that, you know, under these conditions, it doesn't seem to you know, produce much in the way of toxicity. I don't know why. You know, you may have more direct experience in talking to patients and people who treat patients who have overdosed on the combination, because I'm sure they were using much higher doses than here. But I'm not ready to throw out gabapentin entirely. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Bonjour, merci pour votre présentation.
Thank you very much for your presentation. This is a question about the potential of gabapentin of becoming addicted to gabapentin.
There's a lot of evidence that gabapentin by itself has significant abuse liability. Clearly there is some, because you can see that it's sedating, some people like that effect. And I suspect that, if the drug of choice is not available, then people will use the gabapentin. But whether or not it has street value, or if somebody would actively seek out gabapentin, that seems a little bit unlikely, at least in this population of heavy heroin users. And the thing that makes the answer to your question a little bit tricky is that we know that gabapentin is useful for treating withdrawal symptoms. So both alcohol withdrawal, and then there's some limited data to suggest it might be useful for treating opioid withdrawal as well. So, I can imagine a user who is going through, withdrawal symptoms, trying to get gabapentin to treat their withdrawal. It's kind of like, somebody who wants to use buprénorphine. Technically, yes, it's diverted and they're using it to treat their withdrawal symptoms, but that's a little bit different than, somebody just actively seeking out buprénorphine just to party with it.
If there are no further questions, thank you very much, Dr. COMER.
Maintenant, on va écouter le professeur Wim VAN DEN BRINK, qui est professeur de psychiatrie et d'addictologie.
Who is a professor at Amsterdam University. You probably know him. There are many papers by him. He has worked a lot on the treatment of addictions. And today he's going to talk about baclofène and sodium oxybate.
Thank you again for allowing me to speak to you again for the third time today. And it seems that Jean-Pierre always has some kind of a tricky issue for me. Once I talked here on the conference on cannabis and the law. Then I was talking about heroin-assisted treatment. So all these things that you might have a fight about. And so maybe I should now make, before I start my talk, say that this whole issue, in order to be controversial, the whole issue of abuse liability, I think I fully agree with Sandra, is an overrated issue. If we have good medications, really good medications, and there's abuse liability, we're going to approve them, and we just make a system around it to protect abuse and misuse. So I think the issue is overrated, and as soon as we have good medications, we deal with the abuse liability. So I guess I agree with you on that, Sandra. So now I'm going to talk about a little part of the alcohol dependence treatments that are available. And this morning I talked a little bit more about some others. And of course, you have to take into account some of my potential conflicts of interest. This morning I talked a little bit more about the big range of alcohol medications. Today I will look at some of them very specifically because they could be seen as medications that have a role as substitution treatment. As I've shown you this morning, that the history of thinking about alcoholism is long, and it moved from a moral model to a more pharmacological model. And now we're past the psychological, biological, and social model, and we're now in the biopsychosocial model with special attention, I think, to the biological part, and then we talk about the brain disease model. It's still a biopsychosocial model, but with more emphasis, I think, on the biological. And so this is still a seminal paper from 1997. Addiction is a brain disease, and it matters. It shows that addiction is highly genetically determined. It has biological aspects, and especially there's also neurotransmitter systems involved. And that makes it possible that we might influence these neurotransmitter systems and to start treating patients with alcohol and other dependencies. So this is what I showed in the morning. This is the genetic liability, and that translates itself into a system where patients are probably born, or people are born with a liability to become dependent, but of course it's not the biological, genetically system that actually defines, but it's all the interaction with the environment that makes it more likely that people develop the phenotype of addiction. And of course, the drug use itself also is an important component in that. And generally, and now I think a lot of people describe addiction as a combination of a hyper-activated motivational system together with deficient cognitive control system, also called by Nora Volkov the ERISA system, impaired response inhibition and salience attribution system. For this talk, I make it a little easier. I just say that some people are genetically probably liable, easily develop what is called attentional bias after repeated reward. And in the presence of drug-related stimuli, that may cause cue reactivity. Cue reactivity is an activation of some parts of the brain, especially the ventral striatum, but also the orbitofrontal cortex. And in some people, this cue reactivity becomes subjectively present, and then we talk about craving. So that's a nice thing because that prevents us from, it gives a signal that you have to get out of the situation. On the condition that your cognitive control system is working well, so that you perceive the conflict between the immediate pleasure that you can take by taking the drug or abstaining from taking the drug and maybe promote further positive development on the long term. And on the condition that you can stop actually a tendency for action, so motor inhibition is there. So if that's not working, although you actually know that you're in a situation of craving, you still relapse because cognitively couldn't handle that. And recently it was made a little bit more complex because also it's not only the external stimuli that can cause attentional bias and cue reactivity, but it's also the stress and withdrawal symptoms or the internal stimuli that can actually make you cue reactivity and craving and relapse. So in the morning I showed you this kind of a treatment model that if you want to treat people with alcohol dependence or any addiction, you might start to give them an antagonist. So for opiates, that could be naltrexone. And you could also think that you reduce the stress. And you could also maybe think of reducing the craving, or improve the cognitive system by cognitive enhancers. And if all that doesn't work, you might think of giving the drug itself or some substitution of it. So that would be agonist treatment. And for alcohol, we have shown this morning that this is the medications that we have. They're boldly indicated, so these are registered, officially registered for the indication alcohol dependence. If you want to do something about the stress, we know that doxazosin, an alpha adrenergic antagonist, might be an effective medication to reduce alcohol consumption. Anti-craving drugs, we have a long-acting one developed in France, acamprosate. It's bold, and so it's registered as a medication for alcohol dependence. But probably also topiramate and varenicline are very good medications for anti-craving. And as a cognitive enhancer, I've been talking about modafinil, and there is now some new talking about psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin in the treatment of alcohol dependence. So I'm not sure where to put this in the scheme. So I put them in cognitive enhancer, but the cognitive changers of there may be personality changes, so it's hard to say what they really are. And finally, there is this agonist treatment, and David Nutt has been talking about it for a long time, that he's going to make some synthetic alcohol that would have all the benefits of alcohol, but not the negative sides, and so it would be an agonist treatment. And so I think we have some potential candidates, baclofène, maybe in higher dosages, sodium oxybate, gabapentine, although it's not a direct working on the GABA system, but indirectly it has an effect through the calcium channels in the delta-2 system. And of course, CHH5OH, alcohol itself could be a substitution. So this is what we have in substitution treatment, and that makes that there is some possibilities there in the upper right-hand corner for the treatment of alcohol dependence with substitution treatment. So it's been a big debate. I think the nicest papers on this have been published, one in 2012 by Jonathan Chick and David Nutt, and they make some requirements for an agonist treatment. They should have agonist activity, or maybe they say, maybe not directly on the receptor, but they should have an agonist pharmacodynamic effect at least. They should be able to use it orally and with a longer effect, and they should have low toxicity, because otherwise you have an agonist that is as bad as the original drug alcohol. And of course, they already say that if you want to use agonists, I think as Sandra has been shown, then you have to take security measures. So you shouldn't give it to any person to use, but you use probably a specialist setting. You combine it with psychosocial interventions. You have to clearly define what the outcomes are, and you have to realize if you give a pure agonist that has no effect on polydrug use. So a lot of people are polydrug users, and so you have to realize that it will probably do something on alcohol, but maybe not on all the other ones. Although the case of gabapentine shows maybe something different. So if you look at the scheme that I showed you, then the obvious agonist treatments are baclofène, sodium oxybate, and maybe gabapentine. Which is an interesting thing. There have been quite a lot of papers on these medications, and there seems to be some kind of a new kind of activity by research. They're writing not only meta-analysis, but they also write consensus statements. And I think they do that because we have more and more off-label treatments for alcohol dependence. And many of these medications come from other fields of medicine, so they came to us by the process of repurposing. They're not very likely that they're going to be registered officially, because not always there's an interest in the industry to do that. And so it becomes more and more important, if you want to prescribe these medications, it will be off-label. And do you have the support as a clinician to write off-label medications if there's no support from your professional organization? So I think that professional organizations are being confronted with the need from these kind of statements. And because if we have to wait for the FDA or the EMA, we're likely not to have any new medications available. And if we want to use the medications, but then as off-label, we need support from our professional agencies, and maybe also of political agencies, as is the case, for example, with baclofène in France. The gabapentine, I think I'm not going to talk about it, was not my assignment, but it's clear that there has been quite a lot of studies now in alcohol dependence. I think it's obviously an effective medication, not so much for abstinence, but for reducing of the number of heavy drinking days. I think the evidence is pretty strong. But again, will it be registered ever for the indication alcohol dependence? And so this is different. And this is also, was not asked to talk about, but it's an interesting thing that just prescribing real alcohol to homeless alcohol-dependent patients has been quite successful in Canada, and they have most of the time it's homeless people. They drink 40 units a day or more, and so their asked either with or without contingency management to take the alcohol from the program, and but they don't get more than like 20 consumptions. It's not little, 20 consumptions, but it's half of what they normally use. And what you see in these programs, that the number of emergency department visits goes down dramatically, and also the police reports go down dramatically. So as an ultimate harm reduction measure in this very sick and unreachable population, otherwise, maybe managed alcohol programs could be something. But that's not what I'm going to talk. I have to talk about baclofène and sodium oxybate. And so with baclofène, I think there is quite a lot of studies, but the issue is not resolved. This is the consensus paper that was written about a year ago. And basically the conclusion of that paper was that clinical studies showed conflicting results, and that baclofène is often used off-label for alcohol dependence. Definitely in France and in Australia, and definitely also in some other countries. So they wanted to have a review of that in order to make it possible for people in other countries to consider the use of baclofène in certain patients. And so this is what we try to do in this consensus paper. And what it basically shows that right now there is about 15 baclofène randomized control trials. That's quite a lot if you think about how many randomized control trials there are for other medications. And there's about 4 meta-analyses available now. And this is the first meta-analysis that was presented in 2014. At that time, there weren't that many studies. There were 5 low-dose baclofène randomized control trials. And the meta-analysis basically showed that baclofène, in 3 of them, in low-dose baclofène studies, showed a clear effect with an odds ratio of 2.8 in reducing, in obtaining abstinence, which is a nice odds ratio, isn't it? A few years later, there was another meta-analysis, now including 12 randomized controlled trials. And again, it was shown that baclofène had an overall significant effect on abstinence rate. Again, it was an odds ratio of 2.7, which is very close to the 2.8 that I mentioned before, with numbers needed to treat of 8, which can probably increase if we know the right patient using the right medication. But I should also mention that there was no significant of any of the other alcohol outcomes and on craving, anxiety, and depression. There was also no distinction between high-dose and low-dose randomized controlled trials, and there was a debate there. So we did the most recent, or one of the most recent analysis, and that was a meta-analysis including 13 RCTs on baclofène, 7 low-dose baclofène studies, 4 high-dose baclofène studies, and 2 baclofène studies, including low and high doses, and using different outcomes and certain statistics. The paper is published, you can look it up, and this is the very short message of that paper. Basically, it shows that baclofène has significant effects with odds ratios in the around 2 in time to relapse, in the percentage of days abstinence, and in the percent of abstinence at the time of the end of the treatment. But the effect was completely driven by the low-dose studies. So there was a good effect in low-dose studies, and there was no significant effect in the high-dose randomized control trials overall. Another finding was that the best effects were actually seen in patients who were drinking a lot at the beginning of the study. So in heavy users of alcohol, the effects of baclofène were substantially higher than in the people with low doses In a recent Australian study, this was actually replicated, this finding. Probably this is something that is true for most of our medications against alcohol. If you use it in patients with higher drinking levels in the beginning, probably the medication is more effective. Likely to be related to lower placebo effects in the placebo condition. But it's an interesting finding. Also an interesting finding from Australia is that it was mainly the patients with a comorbid anxiety disorder that benefited from baclofène, and that was in the same study. They also found that it was basically in patients with the CC allele in the GABA-B receptor type 1 gene, which probably shows that this anxiety and the GABA system, this is the type of patients that seem to benefit most from baclofène. And you see in the one with the GLL, there was actually no significant effect of baclofène. So it's an interesting finding. It has to be replicated, but it might show the way to patient treatment effectively. Safety is an issue, I think, of baclofène. Of course, it's a medication that works on the GABA system, and safety is an issue there. This is data from France. I think this is a study from 2017, showing a strong increase in baclofène poisoning reports between 2010 and 2013. I must say, in most of these cases, baclofène was combined with benzos and alcohol, but and in the mean dose of these patients who reported poisoning was 300 milligrams or more. So, but there is definitely a risk there. That was also shown in a recent study from Australia. It's serious poisonings because 77% of these reported poisoning cases needed medical care, and 35% had a Glasgow coma scale lower than 3. So I think it's an issue that we should take into account. And they reported that it was basically in most of the patients was with also using other drugs, including alcohol. And they advised that baclofène should only be prescribed by experts, GP expert or addiction experts, and not for impulsive patients, such as patients with borderline personality disorder. There's also an indication that the combination of alcohol and baclofène is risky. I must say the alcohol levels are more important than the doses of the baclofène, but there is an interaction, and if people use more than 35 units of alcohol per day, then every additional 20 milligrams of baclofène increases the risk of serious sedation with about 25%. So there is an issue there in the combination of baclofène and ongoing alcohol use. These are the most important side effects. You can walk through it or ask me to send you the slides. They're basically not that serious, but quite a lot of them are quite persistent, and that is unfortunately. It's mainly seen, more seen in women than in men, and a little less often in patients with psychosis of antipsychotic medication. So my conclusions for the baclofène, and that's stated in the what is called the Gagliari statement, is that baclofène is not or not yet licensed for the treatment of alcohol dependence. So most experience is with baclofène after full detoxification, and combination with alcohol is riskful. Baclofène is, in principle, I would say, a second or third line treatment. The dose dependent effects on the effect and tolerability and safety. Be careful with high doses, at least if you want to go higher than the 30 to 60 milligram. Start low, 15 milligrams per day, and go slow with no more than 5 to 10 milligrams up titration per 3 days. There's no evidence for baclofène during withdrawal. Most side effects are dose dependent, and so if you can stay low, stay low. And of course, baclofène shouldn't be abruptly stopped. So this is some of the most important of the 20-some recommendations that were given in that study. Sodium oxybate is I think more discussed than the other than baclofène. It's being registered, or it was registered in Austria and in Italy. It's being used quite extensively in these countries. I think there's more than 300,000 people treated with this medication in Austria and in Italy. The database is probably a little less strong. I'll give you a little bit of the database. These were the pilot studies between 1992 and 2007. So you see it's around quite a while. And it showed that sodium oxybate was more effective than placebo and than naltrexone in reaching abstinence in these, I would say, proof of principle studies. You see the numbers that are treated are relatively small. And so it's preliminary. There were also 2 phase 3 trials. One was the GATE 2 study in RCT, double-blind, placebo-controlled, with more than 300 patients. And there was significant longer continuous abstinence duration at month 6 and month 12, as you can see in the graph. Over a year, people had on average 1 month less more abstinence if they used sodium oxybate. So it was a clear effect. But then they had a second phase 3 trial. It's called the SMO 32. It's not published yet. Also randomized controlled, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial with almost 500 patients, 12 weeks treatment and 1 week follow-up, 4 different dosages. And there was no significant effect on the primary outcome, probably because of high placebo response, but it was a non-significant effect. And so the companies that want to work on this medication, in this case it was a French company, DNA, they did a post hoc analysis, and what they could show is that there was a significant effect on abstinence and heavy drinking days and total alcohol consumption in the subgroup, again, of very high and high risk drinkers. So in the ones that were alcohol dependent but weren't using that much alcohol at baseline, there was no effect at all. But in the heavy and very heavy users of alcohol, there was a significant effect. But it was a post hoc analysis. Now you would ask, what is the current situation? I'll come back to that, because that's the cliffhanger. I'm not sure how much I can tell about it. How is it with safety? And there's, in some countries, GHB, or sodium oxybate, is a big issue because it's an abuse drug. It has high abuse liability, and people who become dependent on GHB, they're very difficult to treat. The very serious withdrawal deliriums reported. If they're treated either with psychotherapy or with baclofène, the results of treatment are pretty negative, so it's a serious issue. If you look at the safety of sodium oxybate, I think if you look at the randomized controlled trials, and you look at the pharmacovigilance data, it looks very mild, actually. Basically, it's in patients with very serious comorbid disorders, serious psychiatric comorbidity, or more substance use disorder. Maybe there is also some abuse and abuse liability, but especially in the people with psychiatric comorbidity. So altogether, it doesn't look so bad. Now, so the situation is with sodium oxybate that there is indications for efficacy, especially in the very high and high drinking risk groups. It is extensively used, and I think most of our colleagues from Austria and Italy would be very sad if they couldn't use it any longer, because they feel that it really has an important place in the treatment of very severe alcohol-dependent patients. There is not a lot of indications for serious abuse or misuse or very serious adverse events. But I know that DNA is trying to get it registered in Europe with the European Medicines Agency, and it has been a hard road so far. So I think they didn't get as far as getting it registered, and I think the company is thinking about whether to go on with this product or not. So it's one of these situations where the professional group is very having to have this medication, but they might lose it if there's no change in the position with sodium oxybate and the registering authorities like EMA. So what are the recommendations, conclusion recommendation with regard to baclofène and sodium oxybate? I think it's good to state that alcohol use disorders is a treatable brain disease, that we have happily many pharmacological treatment with a clear effect, I think including probably many medications such as topiramate that are not registered for this indication. We also have medications that show promise as an effective medication for the treatment of alcohol dependence, including baclofène and sodium oxybate. And these new substitution treatments are really a nice addition to our treatment armamentarium. And it would be a loss if we can't use them. But I must at the same time say that these are substitution treatments, and that, of course, we have to be very careful with dosing, both in up titration of the dose and in tapering at the end of a treatment, because there are and there can be serious effects and even overdose effects, and there can be serious withdrawal symptoms. So maybe it's also these medications that are off-label, if you want to use them, they're off-label. I think they're not for the general practitioner, at least not in the expert general practitioner, because I think there are in France and in some places there are expert general practitioners, but I think they need special training and competence and show competence. But on average, I think it should be in the hand of experts, and mainly, and that is probable, that might be a problem, like the Australians now say, it should be in comorbid cases. Now, that is a serious problem because, you know, we don't know so many patients with serious alcohol dependence that have no comorbidities. But I think it should be recognized that in this group of difficult patients, there might also be additional risks. And if you have an off-label medication, you have special responsibilities. So I'm not saying no here, but I give a clear warning in that direction. So this is my overview of these things. Thank you very much.
So one or two questions for Dr. Van den Brink.
Oui, bonjour, merci pour cette...
Okay, so good morning and, well, good afternoon, sorry, and thank you very much for this interesting synthesis on this product. Now, about baclofène, I didn't get very well the results of your analysis. Could you be a little bit more specific? It seems that you said that regardless of the dose, only with low doses of baclofène, your meta-analysis would be favorable to baclofène. So now, referring to another meta-analysis that you showed, well, it seems that the effect size tends to 0. So I would like to have a little bit more of an explanation about this, even though you were very clear in your presentation.
Clear. I probably was very clear, but not clear enough. The originally made meta-analysis made no distinction between randomized controlled trials with high or low dose. They just measured, they calculated an overall effect over all the randomized controlled trials. If they would have used the distinction between low dose and high dose studies, they would have seen, as we show, that the effect overall is driven completely by the low-dose studies. Now, there's, of course, much more to say about that, because it would suggest that all the high-dose studies were negative and all the low-dose studies were positive. That's also not the case. Even within the low-dose studies, heterogeneity, and in the high-dose. For example, there was one high-dose study from Germany that was a very small study, but it showed a very clear effect of very high doses. But there was a French study that didn't show any effect of high dose, and our Dutch study doesn't also show any effect of the high dose. But we also didn't find any effect of the low dose. So there is much more heterogeneity. But that is normal for medication studies. If you think about antidepressants that were registered, 2/3 of all the studies on antidepressants were negative. So it's the 1/3 of the studies that were probably also the better studies that made that SSRIs were at the end accepted as medication. So there's much more heterogeneity beyond that. So that's why we say in the consensus, we don't say stick to low doses because that's the only ones that are effective. We say it's proven with the low doses, and if you can stay in low doses, keep there. If you think you can go up, please go up slowly, because there is also a dose effect relationship with side effects.
Maybe your opinion about the issue of using baclofène for reduction or for abstinence maintenance?
Yeah, that's a good question. How to prescribe baclofène? Basically, the two ways. One is the fixed dose, and starting. Most of these studies started actually with people who were totally detoxified, and they were directed at relapse prevention, total abstinence. But there's more the titration like those, and they go for more for reduced drinking. I think it is the experience with that, especially I think in France and in Australia, they're quite positive. I think it's also good to realize that there will then be a time that you prescribe both baclofène, sometimes in rather high doses, together with people who still drink, and you might encounter some intoxication problems that have been shown in vigilance data, both in France and now also in Australia. So I think there is, again, it's the clinical wisdom and the balance that you have to find there.
Merci beaucoup pour cette.
Thank you very much for this very rich presentation.
L'applaudir. Et nous allons passer donc à la.
And now we're going to move to the next presentation by Professor Mickaël NAASSILA, who's a researcher in Amiens. He's going to tell us about baclofène, but precisely our baclofène.
Bonjour à toutes.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much to the organizers for giving me the floor on this session for treatments to alcohol addiction. Well, we don't work on alcohol addiction. We work on patients. We also work on clinical or preclinical models with animals, for example, and we want to try to present what's going on and to be as close as possible to what would happen with human beings. Now, I would like to tell you what we're doing in our lab. We're trying to revisit the individual variability of response to baclofène, and we have wondered about an enantiomer such as our baclofène. Here, my disclosure, and now this is the mechanism of reward and the effects of alcohol. We have here the dopaminergic nucleus in the accumbens nucleus, and we can see how alcohol releases dopamines associated with pleasure, but there's also another mechanism, the release and the inhibition of GABAergic neurons, and we understand very well then how certain treatments are going to target GABA and and opioids in order to modulate this reward mechanism in the brain. And we have this accumbens, nucleus accumbens, that is activated after taking alcohol. So this is a very well established mechanism with baclofène and with GABA-B agonist, and this is a little bit what we find with D2 receptors of dopamine. I do not have a pointer, unfortunately, and these are receptors, and they're going to release dopamine. So we find this phenomenon with baclofène. We have a very nice preclinical study showing that baclofène limits the release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. So, well, our study is not only limited to this, but this explains that whenever we take alcohol, there is that's why there is a kind of rise of consumption. And, well, so we see why this is happening. Now, this is on the efficacy of baclofène in preclinical models. We know since the 80s that baclofène in animals can reduce the acquisition of alcohol. If we use, for instance, 1 dose of alcohol versus 1 dose of other fluid. And now, if we ask the animal to make efforts to take the drugs, we see that baclofène is efficacious when it comes to reducing the likelihood of the animal of taking alcohol or choosing alcohol. The animal is less motivated to take alcohol, so it really reduces the motivation, so the effort that the animals would make in order to take alcohol. And, well, we understand then that this is going to diminish the withdrawal symptoms in the animal. Here, very quickly, we have the effect, on the left-hand side, we have the effect of baclofène for alcohol-preferent animals. We have a study here in Sardinia that shows the treatment on different days, on several days of baclofène, and we see how this reduces alcohol consumption. But when we stop the treatment, this is the dotted line, and then we see that, well, we go back to the beginning, so we take alcohol again. And this is another model that we use in our laboratory. This is the post-dependent state model. Here we have animals who are dependent to alcohol in black. This is the black bars. And the control animals, or non-dependent animals, we see that baclofène is efficacious from 1 milligram doses per kilogram or to 2 milligrams. So we see that there is, in a model of genetic vulnerability, baclofène is efficacious. And so this is for alcohol-dependent animals. We see that baclofène is efficacious. Now, when it comes to mechanisms, the preclinical studies have allowed us to establish several hypotheses. There is a blockage of the priming effect. And the blockage of this priming effect means that we're going to see very important effects in terms of the motivation to take alcohol again. We see also that we can modulate the response and the subjective response to alcohol. We see that these active receptors of GABA-B may modulate the response to initial drinks, so that drinking is less rewarding. But what's interesting as well is that if we want to have the effects of baclofène, we must be under the effect of alcohol. And this is quite interesting. So there's the idea there that we may have to drink a certain amount of alcohol in order to have the inhibitory effects of baclofène when it comes to taking alcohol. We have some studies in baboons, and we see that baclofène suppressed alcohol self-administration when the treatment was initiated during ongoing alcoholic access, but not during alcohol abstinence. So we have results here that should be confirmed. Now, regarding enantiomers, you know that there are so many medications with different forms. There's the R-baclofène, S-baclofène, for instance. And here, baclofène mimics the GABA. And we have the R-baclofène, which is a prodrug. And we know certain things in these alcohol-preferent rodents. We see the reduction of alcohol consumption. And in the middle, we have the effect of R-baclofène, and we have a reduction which is dose-dependent. And we see the effects. So there are other studies on rodents about R and S-baclofène in alcohol-preferent mice. And we see that the black bar, which is R-baclofène, reduces alcohol consumption, whereas S-baclofène increases alcohol consumption. And the same authors found the same results when R or S-baclofène are injected in the nucleus accumbens. So R-baclofène reduces alcohol consumption, whereas S-baclofène increases it. So, well, this might seem a little bit simple considering our models, but this is another reality that we find. We have studied the case of post-dependence. We have here the self-administration of alcohol. In other words, animals have to push a lever in order to take alcohol. So we have to, here we have proved their motivation to take alcohol. And we also have ethanol vapors in order to induce physical dependence. So these are the doses of ethanol vapors. So at the end of this protocol, we're going to find tremors in these animals and the reward mechanism and neuroadaptation, which means that these animals are going to be more nervous and anxious and hyper-motivated in order to take the product. So this leads to a compulsive use. In other words, if we punish alcohol consumption, in spite of punishing, these animals keep seeking alcohol. Now, what do we see in this model? Here in the left-hand side, we have the effect of S-baclofène with all the individuals distributed, and we see that even after 8 weeks under these vapors of ethanol, we have this results in terms of consumption of alcohol. We have 24 rats here, and all of them are going to receive the same enantiomers. We see that S-baclofène has no effect. We see, however, that R-baclofène has an effect with the doses of 1 milligram per kilogram. And the R-baclofène, which is used clinically, has only got an effect with the highest dose, which is 2 milligrams. So the R-baclofène is the most efficacious one of the three. Now, what's interesting here is to see the inter-individual differences. This is something that is not studied enough in preclinical effects. We always work with general populations, but not so much with the individuality. And this is interesting because we have seen that certain individuals do not respond at all to baclofène. Certain individuals will reduce drastically, others will increase drastically the consumption of alcohol, and we can see that also. And the response is mixed with R and S-baclofène. But what we see is that with R-baclofène, we have a very strong reduction, and lots of animals respond to the doses of 2 milligrams, and we see that there are driver locomotion effects. So the doses of 2 milligrams of R-baclofène has an effect on locomotion. So this is the doses that we have considered as significant. And this is a proportion of responders, of good responders to our baclofène. So we studied the different enantiomers once more, and we see the good response, so the reduction of alcohol consumption. So we see that there are better responders with R baclofène than S baclofène. There's no correlation found, however, between the hypolocomotor effect and efficacy on intake, on alcohol intake. So in terms of efficacy, this efficacy has nothing to do with the hypolocomotor effects. And this is quite a rapid effect. We saw that we could test treatments, and we tend to test treatments in an acute way. I mean, the treatment does not last for 2 weeks. We treat them for 1 day acutely, and then there's a recovery phase, and then we treat them again in order to see the response. So we see that S-baclofène has no effect, and for the other enantiomers, so the first point is the baseline, and then there's the response to baclofène, and then the third pattern is the recovery phase, so the day after the treatment. So the day after the treatment, we have joined the baseline again. So we see that with our baclofène, which is efficacious, we have a rebound effect after, or a recovery effect, what we don't see with the other enantiomers. This is the pharmacokinetics, and here there's a lot of variability in the plasmatic rate of baclofène and the elimination curve of baclofène after 30 minutes, 60 minutes, up till 2 hours after the treatment. And we have a very good correlation between the efficacy and the plasmatic rates. So the variability may be related to these plasmatic rates. Now, regarding alcohol seeking, here in this situation, animals do not have access to alcohol unless whenever they press the lever. So this is a little bit like craving. These animals must have certain signals in order to, well, that show their motivation to take alcohol. So we see, again, the importance of these doses in alcohol seeking. And so with our baclofène, there is less variability, and all animals seem to respond better in comparison to the racemic mixture. Here we have dependent and non-dependent rats, and we see that dependent rats respond less well than non-dependent rats. So, well, there are clinical studies that say that for subjective effects, there's a certain tolerance. And we need to work much better on this in order to know a bit more and in order to see why there's this kind of neuronal adaptation in these dependent rats. Now, in human beings, I haven't found many clinical effects, but we have seen here the efficacy of treatment depending on the sex. So here we have patients who will respond very well. This is the number of units taken. So we see that, well, certain individuals do not respond, others increase their intake, others reduce their intake. This study suggests that there is a difference between men and women. So this gender difference is not very much studied in animals, but we're trying to do so a little bit more. And this is something that we did in another model. We developed a lab model of binge drinking. There are going to be certain animals who will be heavy drinkers. We're going to make them drink a lot for 15 minutes and quite regularly. And I'm not going to show you all because I have no time. But what's interesting here is that we see all the somatic damages. We have the liver of a binge drinker, and we have the liver of an alcohol-dependent rat. We know very well what we're talking about, don't we? And here we have binge drinking and the effects depending different drugs used, like nalmefene, naltrexone, baclofène, GHB, acamprosate. And we see how all these drugs are likely to reduce the binge drinking behavior. We see that certain products reduce motivation, except for acamprosate. And here we see how all these treatments reduce relapses in an efficacious way, except for nalmefene and acamprosate. And this was quite to be expected. We see here the clinical effects, motivation, relapse, and, well, we could see what we may expect for human beings. And this is the response depending on sex. We see that baclofène in this binge drinking model is much more efficacious than the racemic mixture, but males are better respondents than women, or than females, sorry. And here we are trying to analyze this with clustering analysis, because we have seen that with binge drinking, we have heavy binge drinkers and milder binge drinkers, and we have differentiated these two populations, and we are trying to analyze our results regarding the severity and the phenotype of binge drinking. And I'm going to conclude by saying that for every individual who does not respond to all the enantiomers of baclofène, we have studied the dopaminergic release on these individuals in order to see if there's a correlation, right, of their behavior and the release of dopamine. And what we see is that and as baclofène reduce the release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, and with S-baclofène, this happens regardless the sex. And this is interesting because, again, we see that there is a behavioral response which is different depending on which baclofène we use, and we see also that there is a response that's different dependent whether we're male or female models. So this is something to be studied more in depth. So you may wonder, what's the mechanism that is involved? Well, in the brain, there are high and low affinity receptors, so more or less sensitive to S-baclofène or R-baclofène. And we see that enantiomers may target different neurotransmitters. We can also imagine that there may be genetic variants to GABA-B receptors, and there can be different pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, and there are also other mechanisms like dopamine release. So, well, this is a little bit what I wanted to show you in terms of this preclinical research and the different behavioral responses to baclofène, and, well, the individual differences. And we see that there are effect sizes, or size effects, and for certain molecules we see an efficacy which is, or which increases as much as the baseline increases. And also, well, there's a balance to be found between the behavioral effects and the sensitiveness of side effects. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
C'est peut-être une question naïve.
Well, maybe it's a silly question, but you know, when we prescribe baclofène, what do we prescribe? Is it R or S? Well, you prescribe the mixture, the R and S baclofène, 50-50. And now if I may add something, we see in animals that it's R baclofène which leads to the intrinsic effect of alcohol reduction intake. and this may be counterbalanced depending on the sensitivity to S-baclofène. So we may expect that there's R-baclofène, so because, well, seriously, it seems more efficacious than S-baclofène. Well, this is not so obvious. We are studying it a bit more in depth because we must check that there are no side effects. Because you saw that we had to reduce the dose from 2 milligrams to 1.5 for R-baclofène. But now there's a molecule which is R-baclofène. It's a prodrug. And the idea is to lead to better absorption of R-baclofène and to release of R-baclofène. It's a development, and for certain pathologies, well, there has been a trial on tolerance for alcohol addiction. So, well, so this is not ready tomorrow, I guess, right? I also have a question. Microphone, please. There's no microphone, it seems. Yeah, because neurologists use baclofène for plaque sclerosis, and the idea is to check whether baclofène is getting into the brain, and because of that, well, there was the idea to promote other kinds of dosages. Now, in animals, since there is this inter-individual variability, is there any data that shows that for one same doses, the amount of baclofène remaining in the brain is different?
Je ne me souviens pas d'étude qui ait démontré ça.
Well, I do not know of any study, or I can't remember of any study having showed this, but we have tested a molecule in our lab that acts on the elimination and the capture of baclofène in the brain and the rate of penetration in the brain. So this is the idea. This is what's being tested right now to see whether, yes, whether it leads or not to a variability between individuals.
Maurice DEMATTEIS. Je suis là-bas. C'est là.
Donc maintenant, je vais laisser la parole au professeur Maurice DEMATTEIS, que vous connaissez tous très bien, qui intervient beaucoup à ce congrès, qui doit jongler entre les sessions. Donc,
well know Professor DEMATTEIS, so he's going to talk about buprénorphine. So he's going to propose another treatment. Thank you, Mickaël. Good evening. You have seen in the presentations, all the presentations of this system. I am going to present the opioid system. Of course, if we are here today, it's because we have to develop new treatments. The issue is important, and it is obvious that the treatments that allow to respond to the need are very limited for the more severe patients, and we have to be very innovative. You have been presented with oxybate and gabapentine and oxyden. And when you use alcohol, we modify the systems. There is not only the GABAergic system. So there are different seizures, and we know that the consumption of alcohol induces a state of stress, dysphoria, and all these are imbalances, and the current treatments want to reestablish the imbalances, and in different presentations, we gabapentine with Sandra and Mickaël NAASSILA with baclofène, and Wim van den Brink with oxybate. So they all regulate the GABA system, but we can diminish the activity glutamate. So this is only a system, a single system. So to act on another one has certain limits in our patients. For instance, we have a good treatment with baclofène and with a good dosage, but it doesn't work. And we have explored other things. Often we think about pleasure. So this is the reward system. This was presented by Ms. NAASSILA. And this is not only dopamine energetic. So we have dopamine and opioid system that intervenes. When you drink alcohol, there is a liberation of beta endorphins and of endorphins. So you have understood when you repeat the use, this doesn't last. And we know very well that the repetition here of this consumption is going to modify the mu kappa balance. And if this system is high and euphoric, so this is going to alter the system and reinforce the kappa system. So this is a system connected to a lot of other systems, the aminergic system, but the corticotrope implied in the stress, in chronic stress, and the regulation of emotions, stress management, and chronic stress. So how can we compensate this deregulation? It is important because we considered if the mu system would be the craving of reward when we go to wanting, to liking, to wanting, we are in dysphoria. It is an appeasement craving. They need appeasement, and we think that this is the implication of the kappa system and the other systems of stress altered by chronic use. Of course, we have to reduce the kappa system and reinforce the mu. What are the molecules available now? Naltrexone and nalmefene. They act on the kappa system in a good sense because they block the kappa, and they are a partial agonist. But for the mu receptor, we would have to reinforce. But so this clue of kappa is interesting in psychiatry as well and in addictology because there are some common paths between both sciences. So what could be the alternatives? Buprénorphine. This is a kappa antagonist, so it's okay, but it is a partial mu agonist. So the profile is quite consistent with chronic alcohol use. So we are going to present some literature, but what does literature say? So it is very in interest for resistant depressions, for anxiety, for resistant depressions. But what happens with addicted patients? We know the history of patients who have this consumption of use of alcohol and opioids. So there is a controversial literature, but there is a study by Nava. We have reproduced it in our patients regularly. So this is a comparison, craving for alcohol or alcohol use, and there is a decrease of craving and of alcohol use over 12 months. So this is for methadone and for buprénorphine, and the doses were up to 30 milligrams a day. So there is something happening, but even we can see this at the clinic level. So we have to explore the patients. So this was a series of patients. This was a paper with dihydrocodeine, but they used other codeines, tramadol, and then we have case reports. So what happens to rodents? Because so this is not. This has no support. This is a work by Roberto Ecochopo, and for the rodent, it reduces the alcohol use, but through another system. We know that there are three targets. It is antagonist, kappa, and morphine, and we know that this is implied in stress, in emotional deregulation. So there is interest for this molecule. The profile of action is very diverse, and through the different aspects, it could modulate our patients who are severely alcohol addicted. So we proposed a study. This is an observation study. So at the beginning, it was how can we help our patients, because we had different treatments, but they didn't work. So we had to propose another thing. And we proposed this treatment for patients that were resistant, and they were not addicted to opioids. But the agreement was very clear. So it was a year of treatment. There were psychotropic properties so that the patient could feel better and could do a certain number of things with some customized titration. So with a permanent, an ongoing assessment, and then we could have a progressive decrease. The patients that benefit, they had an assessment and over a year, and we had to see if there were benefits. We assessed alcohol use, other substances, the craving, and other dimensions. You will see they are quite important for our patients. Anxiety, quality of life, and sleep. So here we have a protocol. We have 22 patients that participated in this study. So those were preliminary results. Other people benefited from this treatment. So you have the titration over 12 months and then the decrease progressively. So this is the treatment. I didn't put all the doses. So those patients, of course, they didn't have tolerance to opioids, but once we could induce the treatment without difficulty, we reached 20 milligrams as an average. But of course, there was a bias. But we increase, we stabilize, and we decrease progressively. And when we look at the parameters, because we didn't know what to do with them, so if we have the audit, the SM5, or the consumptions of alcohol, or the days of heavy drinking, you see that it goes down very quickly. So the craving followed the same dynamics. So we could see this is like for baclofène. So there is So it decreases, but then it lasts. So you see that the benefits are important. All the patients here didn't go up to 24 months for them. In any case, you can see that the benefit is persistent. So here, of course, we had only 6 milligrams a day. So and there was a bias between patients. The other dimensions are interesting. If there is a decrease, a strong decrease for the symptoms, depression symptoms or anxiety symptoms, they decrease, and the quality of life. So it improves, and then it follows the improvement at the end. So this is very interesting. So it's not a placebo effect. We have the impression that something has happened. When we look at other dimensions, we talked about impulsivity, and we see that it decreases. It was a trend. And here we use the task 1 with a simple trend. What is very interesting, contrarily, is the motivations of alcohol use. So we assess the reasons for the consumption of a product. At the beginning, they had reasons for this use. And this is like anxiety and depression symptoms, and then they have less reasons for using the drug. So they are farther away. You are going to listen to a testimony. This is a patient who participated, and he's going to explain his history. I used to drink with people, and then I drank every day, so I had relapses every time, and I fell ill. I relapsed later, and I had pancreatitis, so I had 1 liter of whiskey every day. I had different treatments, but they were not successful. So this lasted between 10 and 15 years. So it means 40 units a day, so it's a big consumption. And this patient came back because he had pancreatitis, so he was about to die. And of course, this is why we proposed him this treatment. When we proposed, at the beginning I was skeptical because it was a treatment for addicts, and it was a bet. I was skeptical because I had tried different protocols and I didn't believe in them. So this was a last treatment, a last opportunity that we proposed to him. We had a lot of concern, and this is what he thinks. So with this protocol, I don't feel like using alcohol. So this is the first time I feel this. So there was not desire or the strength for consuming. So I have another quality of life, of course. Of course, it's not only the medication, because you have tough moments when you are with people who drink. You can feel like drinking, but then you don't do it. So I reclaimed my personality. I don't want to destroy it again. So you will see that there is use, and then there are other dimensions that were impacted by the treatment for anxiety and for craving. How was your craving? It was very, very very intense at the moment of awake. If I felt bored, I wanted to drink, to feel joy, to feel more content or less depressed. I had less, I felt less bored. And it was quite sudden. It was after 2 months of treatment. He was on 14 milligrams a day, so it was much more progressive. But this anxiety is a very important. We are in a strategy of appeasement. It was relief for this patient. And he will come back, because there is a question when you are an addict to alcohol. Are you going to have devious behaviors? There was no euphoria, but there was a lot of anxiety. I am relatively anxious. We saw that, and now there is less. I don't have nightmares, and so I had nightmares. I couldn't sleep well. So this is interesting, and he comes back to anxiety. So this is an essential dimension, and we describe this dysphoric state. When you have anxiety, you don't sleep well. So he was using cocaine, and Ivan Monteillac mentioned this. There was an effect. The craving extended to other drugs, and there was less craving for consumption. And I didn't want to be in such a state. So this is a little bit more complicated because there are other elements. We treated him for other things. Here, he's calm, but the first time I couldn't talk to him. I couldn't say a word. So it's quite complicated because there is another person, a person who is able to express many things. The craving is a trans-addiction dimension. This is exactly like anxiety. And were there side effects? Because he had 32 milligrams. Sometimes I felt very sleepy, dizzy. So you want to sleep after meals, and when I was driving, so I had to calm down, but I could still work. So this was during the whole protocol, where yes, when the doses was increased, and of course, buprénorphine, alcohol. So these are classical, and we didn't have problems. And there were no side effects, and there was nausea, but this was controlled by anti-emetic treatments. So the score is pathological. So it was less than 11, and there were no concerns if the increase was progressive. So I saw that this drug was very good for my expectations. I didn't want to modify it because it met my expectations. In the cohort of patients, they had over-consumed because they were looking for anxiolysis. In order to conclude, of course, this is only an observation study, but there is an improvement of patients that had been treated unsuccessfully. So we see that something has happened in several resistant patients. So there is a therapeutic effect. We should explore what were the receptors, because we don't have a specificity. We are affecting different systems. We had 32 milligrams, but we can see many things. And we had little problems, but we have to be humble, because this is a system among others. And it was a little bit more complicated when there was another psychiatric problem, and we see that there is a trend. They only want to change their comfort zone. So, of course, you have to implement other approaches. I don't know if this is last resort treatment. We need to have randomized control trials, but it is hope for our severe patients. Thank you. Okay.
Merci pour votre présentation. J'aurais deux.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Among the patients, was there a group who had used opioids during their teen years, and they changed to alcohol, or did they use methadone? So, people who had problems with alcohol. There was one female patient who had used opioids. The others didn't have any experience. We had patients with such anxiety that we proposed a treatment with methadone, but it was a second intention, because once again, the aim is how to help our patients with the least dangerous treatment. And then we could propose it. But those were rare cases with anxiety levels. So we had a severe problem of anxiety. And there were co-treatments, because there was psychiatrics, but it was not enough. I have a lot of comments. I'm going to finish on a question. For many years, we have patients who heavily drink, and methadone was working well, because we didn't use this dose of 32 milligrams. I want to be prudent. So we have profiles that are identical to opioid patients. I have this patient. He comes 3 times. So it is not an anecdote. Sometimes we are looking. So if he had consumed heroin, he could perhaps explain some other things. So the question is not the ethics. Are we going to give opioids to people who have never used them? Are we going another general practitioner who is going to follow But we have a lot of work to do in this domain. Of course, we want to help our patients, but I think we have to do it rigorously. We proposed a protocol with evaluations. They have our data and they can contact us. So when we are outside AMM, so how can we help the patient? So we want to show that today we have to carry out studies to validate if this is real, so it seems so. It has been done very seriously, but we have to prove it because clearly some of our patients will benefit from it.
Allez-y.
Étant donné la chronicité,
we know that those alcoholic pathologies are chronic. When you want to decrease the dose, do you want to maintain a minimum dose on a long-term basis? Some of the patients don't take anything. And when we decrease, of course, anxiety comes back, even with more classical treatment. If we hadn't done it, we wouldn't know. Sometimes decreasing the dose gives us a lot of things to understand, and some of them will require a longer treatment with a much more progressive decrease. Sometimes they need, and some of our, on these patients, we see that they didn't invest in this. I always have the impression that, I don't know if Professor Gros is here, we have cognitive mechanisms when somebody is a user, memory, for instance, brain plasticity. It's very difficult to change anything. So a strong psychotherapy makes sense if we can, after the withdrawal, we can do this. Of course, you have to be patient. So you have to be very patient, and then you will change your life. So they wanted to be better, to do the investment, but of course, we have a lot of personality disorders, and they have a very strict functioning, and sometimes don't want to change their behavior. And we saw this. This is an element of a possible failure.
Et ce qui est intéressant aussi, c'est la cinétique relativement.
So we need more time, and we can imagine different mechanisms other than the decrease of alcohol. So these are the mechanisms that we have with antidepressants, with a deferred result. And those are readaptation, plasticity of the synapsia. And this is deferred. So we have the impression that something is happening. And it is not placebo. This is not only the honeymoon. these patients were in a failure, in a therapeutic failure. Any other question? I am going to conclude. Thank you very much to all the speakers for this session. Thank you.